Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Fantastic. Well, please take a seat. I see a lot of excitement in this room, which is a very good sign, because usually after lunch, people fall a little bit asleep. And we heard this morning, if you remember, that sleep is very good for the health and for the brain. But believe me, clapping and cheering also is very good for the health and the brain. So before we begin, I want to hear Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to begin, and our dear speakers are here and ready. So the second panel today is on the theme of reducing inequalities in development and learning. So we will see the contribution of brain sciences. And this panel today is moderated by the professor and director of the Child and Development Laboratory at Université de Paris. He's also a senior member of the IUF. So his expertise hopefully promises to enrich our thoughts on this crucial theme. So please join me in welcoming Grégoire Borst.
Does that work? Okay. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be moderating this session. And so I'm going to try to rush a bit like the first part so we can start like going into the science, basically. So I will call, not on stage, but online, there will be Professor Charles Nelson, who is a professor of education and pediatrics at Harvard University. Then I will call on stage Kathy Hirschpasek, who is professor at Temple University and senior fellow of Brooklyn. Is that it? Great, come on stage. And then I will call Professor, you can take a seat, anyway. Then I will call Professor Edward Mellish, who is Professor of Developmental Psychology at Oxford University. Come with us. Great.
And Grégoire, we also have, to enrich this conversation, we also have some experts joining us here today. So give a warm welcome to Angela Lowe, expert on emotional intelligence, resilience, and parenting from Canada. Thank you for joining. We have the founder general delegate Ensemble pour la Petite Enfance NGO and member of the first 1000 Days Commission, France, Nathalie Casso-Vicarini. And last but not least, we have Professor of Neonatal Medicine and Vice Dean, Faculty of Medicine, Imperial College London, Professor Nina Modi. So Grégoire, now that I've warmed up the stage for you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I leave it up to you. Thank you.
Great. So the way it's going to go is that we're going to have each time an expert speaking, a speaker or a professor talking, and then we'll have one of the experts reflecting on what they just heard from a practitioner point of view on how to basically implement that either at the practical level or more at the policy level, because that is also what we want to reflect on today. And then there will be a conversation between the experts and the speakers for another 5 to 6 minutes. And then we try to open the floor to this discussion so you can actually also ask the questions that you're dying to ask us, basically. And so we try to reflect on it. So I'm going to do a brief introduction. When I say brief, I feel I am like my other colleagues, that we tend to speak too much and too long. So I'll try to be very quick and rush to it, because a lot of things are going to be said by my colleagues, but it shows also where we are when we think about inequalities and the way to fight inequalities in terms of education, cognitive development, and learning, is that we tend to converge in the way we see the issues of inequalities and the way we should act on it. So very quickly, I need to have something to get the slides. Oops. going back. Just to start, like we all talk about the learning crisis, and we are in the post-COVID era, and I just want to just make a quick point about it. Is if we look at it, we can look at it within the question of inequalities within educational system or across educational systems. And if you look at this actually interesting figures that was actually published by the OECD and UNESCO and UNICEF, what it shows here is the results of countries before COVID at PISA. And we heard about PISA, and I do have a lot of also issues with PISA, but like sometimes it's also interesting to look and to distinguish between different countries. But what is interesting is what it shows here is the amount of time schools were closed depending of the result they had at PISA 2018. And what you see is that the countries who had like the lower scores at PISA are the one where the schools stayed closed for the longer period of time. So we increased the inequalities across countries, and which will be something we should also think about when we think about inequalities at the global level. But if you look within a country, and that's what you had on the right part of this slide, what you see is the impact of school closure on learning gain in students. And what you can see here is that it didn't affect the students in the same way. So students from lower socioeconomic status are the ones who basically had the most loss in learning gains over other students. So there is within countries inequalities that have been growing out of the COVID crisis, but also between countries inequalities. So if we think globally, basically there are more inequalities across countries because of COVID and school closure. If we look at what could be also explaining the effect of socioeconomic status, basically, so those type of inequalities on the pre-academic skills that are critical for the rest of your learning through life. And of course, what I'm thinking about here is language. So we know language is extremely important in the early years. If you don't like acquire good oral language abilities, then you're gonna have issues acquiring good reading skills, and then it's gonna have an effect on all types of literacy. But early math is also super important, super predictive of your ability to learn well at school. And this is data from the Ministry of Education in France. We use actually a task that was designed by CADI to assess language development of kids. And what we showed is that when you enter preschool in France at 3 years of age, and there is universal preschool in France, basically, so you can test the representation of the global population, what we found basically that SES had an effect on pre-academic skills in both language and math, but this was strongly mediated by the effect of socioeconomic skills on executive functions. And Edward's going to talk a lot about executive functions, but if you want to think about it, what are executive functions? It's all the abilities that we need to regulate the way we think, the way we select strategies when we are in a learning process, the way we regulate our emotions, and the way we regulate our behaviors. So it means that when we think about how to regulate and reduce inequalities, it's not just about the language and the math that we need to increase in preschool years. It's also to think about all these other processes that are more difficult basically to assess, but also to observe in children. And so that's been done by one of my PhD students, Margot, who is like somewhere in the audience. The other thing is when we looked, and again, that's going to be talked about later, so I'm going to rush to it, and especially Charles is going to talk about like the effect of adversity on the brain. But if you look at how the brain is affected by socioeconomic status, it's essentially due to different properties of those environments. And especially the brain and the development of the brain will be affected by chronic stress, the quality of sleep. We heard about the importance of sleep in the development of the kids and the development of the brain, but also the home environment. And all of those factors will have an effect on the brain already at the in utero and will continue throughout the development of the brain early on. This is basically a slide showing that at 4 months of age is all the areas in the brain that are affected by the socioeconomic status of the families. As you can see, it's not just a small areas of the brain. And actually, if you look at the system that are actually critically affected by socioeconomic status, it's a system engaged in language, rules learning, emotional regulation, and long-term memory. Basically, everything that you need to basically learn. And what we found in the lab, and we already talked about that this morning, it will affect language development. We talked about the fact that at 3 years of age, you get massive differences in the number of words in the vocabulary of the children, depending on the socioeconomic status of the families. But what we showed with another of my PhD students who is here, Melanie, is that if you look at how come the socioeconomic status affect math and language, what we found is that at the end of preschool, number of those differences are explained by actually the ability of the children to reflect on their own strategies when they learn. It's what we call metacognitive abilities. So basically, that's important because for a policymaker perspective, but also for practitioner, it means that maybe this is what you should try to engage in with your students in the classroom when you teach about math or when you teach about language. And so we've been doing a number of different interventions. This is one intervention aiming basically at reducing inequalities by actually engaging the parents. But the issue is like, how do you engage with those parents that are from low SES? Because those parents tend to not be necessarily the one responding well when you do, like, for instance, the parent-teacher meeting. Those are the one not coming. So we're trying to do that by having small videos explaining small key elements of how the children develop and learn. And so we translated that in multiple languages, and what we're interested in is whether it reduces a bit social inequalities in terms of learning. I won't go through the results, but just what those results shows that if you look at the perception of, for instance, parents about the intelligence and the way their children learn, you see that if they're from low SES background, they tend to think that basically intelligence is something super fixed. You can't do a lot of things about it. And the higher the economic status, the higher the more they think that intelligence is something that you can act upon. And so if you don't change that in the way the parents think about the learning of the children, then you can do the best intervention you want. It won't have necessarily an effect. And the second thing we're trying to do at the moment is also to say, well, if you really want to have an effect, and if you're a researcher, it's great, you can do in the classroom, do a couple of interventions, but if you want to scale up, that won't work. You need to find a way to change the way the teachers or the early childhood practitioner are actually changing the way they interact with the children. So this is what we've been doing, trying to do with Melanie and Liz, who are also in the audience. So we train the teachers in preschool for 18 hours to try to get more of this reflective mindset into their students when they learn about math and language and oral language. And we look at whether it changed anything and whether it transferred to other activities. And just to go, and this is very preliminary, but basically we do have transfer in math abilities. So it seems that you can actually enforce different type of teaching and have different ways of reducing some of the inequalities, for instance, in maths and as early as the preschool years. Moving quickly, I'm not going to go into that, but we also need to create materials, and Kathy is going to talk about that. It's great, we do great research, but if it stays in our lab, it's not interesting whatsoever. So we need to engage all the way and try also to find ways to create materials that the teachers can use in the classroom. And just to show you one of the things that we've been creating in France, this is a game, it's called Flexi Game. It's to train flexibility in the classroom, and it's been using in 5,000 classrooms all over France. And it's actually a way to train executive functions in the classroom. Okay, so if we want to bridge the gap, the key here is where we are the researcher on the far right, and we need to engage with everyone, basically, not just the policymakers. We need to engage with the teachers. We need to engage with the practitioner. But we also need to talk to the school leaders. We need to talk to the media. We need to talk to the parents. Otherwise, we won't have an effect. So that's what we're going to try during our conversation, is also to go from the research to how we can apply that at a practical level and at the policy level. And Edward is going to talk about the policy level, basically. And the other questions, and I think there was like this morning something very important, is like why sometimes it doesn't work. And I think it's not just about the key elements of the interventions, in what basically are the barriers to use the research. And if you look at these different barriers, of course you cannot see anything here, there is a couple of things you can look at. A, people don't really know, the practitioners don't know where to find the information. So we need to do a better job to convey the information in such a way that the practitioner can actually be aware of the type of research we're doing. The second thing is they don't have the time. that's also one of the issues. They don't have the time to spend basically a lot of time, including in their practice and the way they teach the type of things we're doing in our lab. So we need to also to think at the policy level how we can have more time for the teachers to engage in such a process. And the last thing is also to do research that are meaningful for the teachers. So it's great, we do great research, but if they are not addressing issues within of the practitioner in the field, then they are meaningless for them. So we need to think also about a way to engage more horizontally with the teachers. So going from the teachers to the classroom and from the classroom to the lab, and not just the lab to the classroom way, basically, of thinking. And the last point I want to make, and I think Kathy was talk about that, it's great to do research in our countries in the global north, but actually the key issues of education are in the global south. So we need to find ways to engage way more in doing research where it counts or where it matters in terms of inequalities, which is basically in the global south. And if we want to do that, we need to do capacity building for the research in the global south to do those research and not being the one in the global north, just going in the global south, collecting some data, doing great papers, and that has nothing and has no effect on the educational system over there. So we really need to think this way, and I just want to make one comment because UNESCO are doing something along this way. There is a global education coalition launched by UNESCO. There is a global alliance on the science of learning for education, and I strongly advise you to see what we're trying to do at the global level. Thanks a lot. I was thanking all the members of the lab because it's a big lab. There are 60 people working on those issues, and a lot of people are here in the audience. And so now I'm giving the floor to Charles.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I need permission to share my screens, and can that be arranged? It says you cannot share screen while the other participant is sharing. Okay, here we go. So thank you for inviting me, and my talk will be a little bit different than what we just heard. In the next 12 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is the impact that early adversity has on the course of child and child brain development. So I'm going to begin by discussing briefly the role of experience in brain development, different ways of thinking about adversity, how adversity becomes biologically embedded. I'm going to give you a case study, just one or two words on a particular type of adversity, which is psychosocial deprivation, and then I'll draw some conclusions and implications. So let's start with some principles of brain development. We know that genes supplies the basic blueprint for brain development, but experience adjusts this blueprint and it shapes the neural architecture of the brain according to the needs and the distinctive environment of every individual. This means that no two brains are alike. Even identical twins have different brains because they absorb experiences differently. And so I want to emphasize that, particularly after birth, it's experience that plays the largest role in shaping the course of brain development. Now, many of you have probably heard about the nature-nurture debate, which was fashionable in the 1970s, but most neuroscientists and molecular biologists now know that almost all of behavior reflects an interaction of genes and environment. So here's a teenage daughter saying to her mother, nature, nurture, either way, it's all your fault. And the point, of course, is that we can blame our parents for the way they raised us and also for inheriting genes we got from them. But you should think of behavior as an interaction of genes and environment. And that's why when I talk about the role of experiences, experiences are writing against a background of genetics. The next thing to know is that there are points in time, points in development, when the brain is particularly responsive to experience. And we often refer to this as a critical period. And so what this is telling us is that given this heightened brain plasticity, usually associated with the first 1,000 or so days of life, we can think of this period as a period of opportunity or a period of vulnerability. So if a child is exposed to positive experiences during this time, this can bias development in a positive direction. And conversely, if they're exposed to negative experiences or adverse experiences, this can bias the system in a negative direction. And these negative sequelae can persist across the entire lifespan. Now, I want to emphasize the reason I say bias the system is that this is not deterministic. Not everyone who is raised in a wonderful family with wonderful experiences has great outcomes, and not everyone exposed to profound adversity has bad outcomes. But it's just simply that these experiences bias the system in one direction or another. So let's now turn to what is it we mean when we talk about adversity. And the way to think of this is that in the context of psychosocial adversities, there's a continuum of normal experiences. So for example, with income, we have a continuum of profoundly poor to very, very affluent. Parental education, little education, great deals of education. Housing insecurity, housing security, stressful life events, parenting behaviors. So when we think of this, don't think that these are dichotomous, but rather adversities exist on a continuum. And for people like me, one goal is to understand what's the inflection point where when you tip over at a certain point, then the consequences are dire. Similarly, we have biological adversities. We have malnutrition, we have infection, we have environmental toxins. And I'm going to emphasize the infection only because our first speaker emphasized the need to study children outside of upper income Western countries. For 10 years, I've been running a lab in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And this is actually a picture I took up the block from my lab, which illustrates open sewers and high levels of toxins that get in the water, and then people drink the water, and then they become ill, and so on and so forth. So a number of years ago, a medical student working with me and a postdoc working with me came up with this model of a way to illustrate the biological embedding of adversity. So I'll start on the far left where it says early childhood adversity. This could be an exhaustive list. Just think of these things as the long list of things that can impact development. Now, the other thing, as you look a little bit below that, critical periods, is to say these experiences can occur at different points in development. The earlier they occur, perhaps the more consequential the outcomes. And then as we move to the middle where it says biological change, keep in mind that all these experiences are writing against a genetic background or genetic endowment. And that can, in turn, this gene-environment interaction leads to epigenetic changes. So epigenetics refers to the fact that you're changing the expression of DNA without actually changing the structure of the DNA. We have neurodevelopmental disruptions like inflammation, altered homeostatic systems like changes in your microbiome, and then excess inflammation due to, for example, heightened stress responses. All of these things can then shift developmental trajectories. And this is particularly true, as our first speaker also emphasized, in the case of poverty. So it can lead to early setbacks that can compound social disadvantage later on. Biological change then becomes embedded in behavior, and then this in turn increases the risk of things like cognitive deficits, problems with executive functions, mental and somatic illness, physical illness, and the like. These are the ways that various people have used to model the effects of adversity. Let me go back here. The specificity model, which probably doesn't really work, is that each form of adversity has a unique mechanism that leads to a unique outcome. What this disregards, of course, is that many forms of adversity co-occur. So it's unlikely that there's only one type of adversity. It's more likely that there are compounding effects of adversity. The middle, the cumulative risk, is sort of the ACEs model, the adverse childhood experiences model, which is, it's not so much what type of adversity, it's simply the number of adversities you experience in those early years. And so there are data to support the view that the more early life adversity exposures you have, the more consequential the outcomes later on. But this disregards the timing and it disregards the nature of those experiences. And then this dimensional approach argues that it's probably three categories of adversity: deprivation, when children are deprived of things that should occur in the natural environment, like pattern light or sound or caregiving; threat or harshness, like physical abuse; and unpredictability, which is also very, very consequential for kids' development. A number of years ago, the Centers for Disease Control came up with what they call the ACEs pyramid. And I want to illustrate here what this is telling us. So if you look at the very bottom, generational embodiment and historical trauma. We could think of institutional racism here. We can think of any number of other forms of discrimination. Then followed by social conditions and local contexts. And then on top of that would be adverse childhood experiences. So the assumption is that if the foundation has already been laid in a culture or a society for there to be systematic racism, for example, or poverty, then adverse experiences sit on top of that and impact development even further. That leads to disruptions in neurodevelopment. That can lead to changes in social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. You'll hear more about social, emotional, and cognitive development in a little bit. This, in turn, now think of adolescence, for example, can lead to the adoption of risky health behaviors. We can think of a long list: smoking, drinking, not wearing a seatbelt, unprotected sex, etc. This in turn increases the risk of disease, disability, and social problems. And sadly, all of this can lead to a premature death. So in just 2 minutes, I'm going to give you simply one case study, which is what happens when children are deprived of parental care. So this is a study that two colleagues and I started 23 years ago, looking at children abandoned at birth and then raised in institutions in Bucharest, Romania. And the goals were to look at the effects of institutionalization, which is a form of profound neglect. And keep in mind that in many countries, 80% of the cases reported to Child Protective Services involve neglect. A second goal was to determine if these effects can be remediated by an intervention, in our case, foster care. And a third was to improve the welfare of children in Romania and elsewhere by looking at an alternative to institutional care. So here's the study design. Children were abandoned close at birth or close to birth, put in an institution. We did an extensive baseline assessment on them, and then we randomly assigned half of them to continued institutional care, half to foster care. And then we also recruited a sample that never institutionalized children. The original goal was to study these children until they were 3 or 4, but that goal has been expanded because we've been able to study them longitudinally, and we've just completed a 21-year follow-up, and we'll soon hear the outcome of a grant to look at these kids again when they're 27. There are, of course, many ethical issues here, but we can maybe talk about those later. I'm happy to share papers with you about this. One finding I'll just illustrate. At baseline, before randomization, when they're still very young babies, we recorded their EEG. We place sensors on the top of the head. We can color code the amount of brain activity. And what you're looking at here is a view from the top down, the nose at the top, back of the head, left side, right side. And what you look at here in the institutional group compared to the never institutional group is a dramatic reduction in brain activity. The red represents much more brain activity, the green much less. So it's as though it's like turning down, using a dimmer switch to turn down the luminance in a light. If we fast forward to age 8, the upper left, institutional group, the upper right, kids placed in foster care after the age of 2. These groups are identical. But if you look at the lower left, these are kids placed in foster care before 2, and they're identical to the never institutionalized group. So earlier placement, and this is the idea of a critical period, leads to better outcomes. So to summarize, institutional rearing increases the risk for serious impairments and delays in most domains of development. High quality foster care reduces but doesn't eliminate these developmental delays and deviance. Earlier placement leads to more recovery. Quality of foster care matters, as does stability. So conclusions: brain development begins just a few weeks after conception and it continues through young adulthood. Experience matters, particularly during critical periods of development. Sadly, tens of millions of children around the world are exposed to a host of biological and psychosocial hazards during early development, and the effects of these hazards can become biologically embedded and persist across the lifespan. And of course, new work also suggests it may then persist across generations. And the bottom line is, if we can't prevent exposure to adversity, then we should intervene as early as possible. So thank you very much, and I'll stop talking there. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time for one of our experts to reflect on what she just heard. So we welcome Natalie Casso-Vicarini, and then she can ask a few questions to the speakers.
Thank you, Grégoire. Thank you, Professor Nelson. As you shared, soft skills are central protective factors. And social and emotional skills starts with interacting and talking with a baby. For the World Health Organization, they are the 21st century skills on this very uncertain planet because they are the foundation of the house, the basis of the holistic development. It is recognized by almost 30 years of longitudinal studies and recent research, and by a large majority of countries, and more since the Tashkent Declaration. All professionals of the child ecosystem should meet the opportunity to be trained. A neuroscience train the trainers program is key, starting with a strong focus on social and emotional skills to tackle adversity. Executive functions, as you may know, are the cornerstone to build confidence and reduce gaps between children from the very early stage. That's why I'm happy, because we're talking about field, to introduce to you our champion. This is the champion. His name is Pilou. And he's a champion for 3 reasons. The first one, he comes from a very recent evidence-based research from Quebec to France, and he's implemented by our NGO. The second reason is he's accessible. We've been talking with Professor Ekman this morning. He's also public interest, so it's very accessible. There is 15 progressive workshops with children and professionals, and it builds bridges in between 17 months of age to school age of the children, and we talk with, of course, parents at home. The child is, in this method, of course, the key actor. And the third reason is from Tashkent. And Pilou is now traveling to Europe and some French-speaking countries to build cooperation. We've been talking about it: empathy, motivation, attention, self-regulation, to facilitate core competencies, to understand the world, and to tackle mental health issues, which is very intense today. So in France, the debate on educational quality in daycare centers is raging, because too many children are facing adversity, as you said. So I've got this first question to you, Professor Nelson. Why is neglect so bad for child brain development, particularly in the early years? Thank you.
That was an excellent question. So the reason is that after birth in particular, the brain is waiting for a set of instructions to help build itself. So the brain is constructed based on input it's getting from the environment. If the input is lacking, like the lack of visual input or the lack of auditory input or the lack of caregiving, the brain is left to itself to figure out what to do. And so the reason neglect is so disruptive to brain development is that it's as though no one's talking to the brain and no one's giving it a set of instructions. And as a result, it winds up being miswired. And so I think that's why we think that neglect is much more insidious than even abuse is, which is unfortunate to say, but neglect leaves the brain on its own to figure out what to do.
Thank you. I'll go to the second question.
Go ahead.
Can you help us better understand what a critical period is?
Yes. So I can do it a couple of different ways. I'll try to keep it simple and not go into the molecular biology. But the way to think of this is that we have trillions of connections among our brain cells, right? These are called synapses. And we massively overproduce synapses early in life, and then we prune them back. And the pruning occurs through exposure to the environment. And it's a way to make the brain more efficient. It's as though we're saying, you may have 1 billion synapses, but you really only need a million synapses in this one circuit. And so a critical period corresponds probably with the peak of overproduction of synapses when the brain is ready to receive input. But once the synapses have been pruned back, it's difficult to change the brain. So an example is a baby who's born blind or who's born deaf and doesn't have their vision restored, say they had cataracts, or doesn't have their hearing restored, say they had a cochlear implant. In those early years, by the time they get the surgery for their eyes or their hearing when they're, say, 4 or 5, by then they've dramatically pruned back synapses and the brain has lost plasticity. So that's one thing. We also know about the molecular biology. There are molecular cues that apply the brakes, so to speak, and that's highly regulated. And there's evidence to suggest that you can actually lift those brakes, but we're not ready to do that in the human quite yet. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much. Can I have a third question?
Yeah, but like then the answer needs to be quick and the question should be quick.
Okay, very quick.
I promise.
Besides the first 1,000 days, are there other critical periods in development?
So there's speculation that the onset to adolescence may represent another critical period. Sarah Jane Blakemore at Cambridge has advocated this position. It still remains to be determined if it's the same critical period as you see in the first 1,000 days. Okay, well, that was the quickest I can answer that.
Great, and I think it's great that you say that also, because it leads like some opportunity, basically. Thanks a lot for this first part of our interactions. Thanks so much, Charles. Thanks so much, Natalie. So now we give the floor to Edward, and he's going to talk about brain development and policy implication for ECCE.
Okay, I'm going to talk about brain development and policy implications for early childhood education and care. Now, how do I change the... Press the green one? Yeah. Okay. Okay, across the OECD, we see over 20% of children start school without the basic minimum functions, more basic minimum skills for full functioning in a modern society. So 22% of children enter school with developmental problems. And the disadvantaged children are 5 times more likely to have low literacy. Most importantly, 1 in 3 disadvantaged children start school with poor language. And as Heckman showed, poverty increases the risk of poor literacy, numeracy, school failure, unemployment, antisocial behavior, substance abuse, mental and physical health. But early experience is critical in this link. And this is one thing you should remember if it's the only thing you remember from today. Interactions drive development. And that's what underpins this link between early experience and long-term outcomes. For example, here we have some data from the UK. The blue line, the blue graphs represent children from different quintiles of the population, the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the middle 20%, the 20% above middle, and the top 20%. And the blue lines represent children in the 1990s who had no early childhood care and education. And the red line represents those children from the same groups who had some early childhood education and care. So that indicates that early childhood education and care across the population can have some beneficial effects. Now, good quality early childhood care and education improves most aspects of development, but the most important for long-term development are language development and self-regulation. These aspects of development are strongly linked to long-term development. Now, first of all, some evidence from neuroscience to back that up. I'm going to draw upon Charles Nelson's work to some extent here. First of all, we have 100 billion neurons at birth. That's all you ever get. And they start dying off, so everything's downhill from then on. So brain development is about synapses and how synapses form and drop out. Now, in particular, we have this phenomenon, which Charles Nelson mentioned, of pruning of synapses. If a synapse is not reinforced by experience, it drops out. So use it or lose it. And that's a good motto for all of your life. So synapse development influences brain plasticity, learning from experience, and declines with age. Now, here's a diagram I originally did in my PhD thesis. But I took it from work by John Connell, which was done back in the 40s. We have an area of the brain, in the language section of the brain, at birth. And we see at birth, we have very few synapses. The same area of the brain at 2 years of age, masses of synapses. The same area of the brain at 6 years of age, still a lot of synapses, but a lot less. What's happened between 2 and 6? Well, what's happened is those synapses which weren't reinforced by experience dropped out. Okay? Now, here's a graph originally produced by Charles Nelson, and look at the blue line. The blue line represents synapses, synapse formation in the language area of the brain. And you see that it shows a peak around 9 months of age and falls off towards 4 to 5 years of age. Now, when you see that peak at 9 months of age, you might initially think, oh, that's when most language development is taking place. But it's not. Most language development is taking place in that fall-off period, down to 4 to 5 years, which makes that period for up to 4 to 5 years the sensitive or critical period for language development. Because what is happening is evolution has set the brain up such that at 9 to 12 months of age, the child can learn any language that might ever exist in human beings. But of course, the child doesn't learn every language that might exist in human beings. It only learns the 1, 2, or 3 languages that exist in their culture. So all the synapses, which have to do with all the things the child doesn't experience, drop out. And that's why you get this fall-off in the synapses there. And this is the reason for that particular sensitive or critical period, as Charles Nelson earlier said. Now, this makes that period up to 4 to 5 years of age critically important for language development. And it's exactly the time when people who work in early childhood care and education are working with the children. So it's critically important they realize this, and they realize the importance of language experience for the children they're working with. Now, language development underpins cognitive, educational, and social development. A child with poor language at 3 years will be at risk unless intervention is taken. But experience alters the brain. Now, here we see a graph which has been represented from Hart and Risley. This is the 4th presentation of this evidence. Basically, we find clear differences in language experience related to socioeconomic disadvantage. Basically, by age 4, there's a 30 million word gap between children in advantaged homes versus children in very poor homes. And here we see a graph, again represented for the 4th time today, of how that affects language development over the first 3 years of life. The more experience of words the children are getting, the better their language development. Now, that's language development. It's critically important. It's critically important because the whole of our education system, and also our social system, is based on language. A child who can't express itself well can't have good social connections. A child who can't write an essay well will do badly in physics as well as in English literature. Because, all of our education system is based on language. Now, self-regulation is also very important. A child with good self-regulation will pay attention when needed, remember instructions, manage emotions, complete tasks, wait their turn, and can communicate their wants and needs. They're life ready. Now, self-regulation at 5 years predicts later development. A longitudinal study in New Zealand, which I think Heckman mentioned earlier, shows that self-regulation measures in early childhood predict outcomes at age 30 in terms of health, wealth, and crime. It was a stronger predictor than social class or IQ. Now, if we look at the development of executive function, which are the foundational skills of self-regulation, that is, executive function plus experience leads to self-regulation. We see that executive functions develop very slowly in the first 3 years of life. Then they show a great spurt between 3 and 6 years of age, and then they level off across the school years. What that means is that the period 3 to 6 years of age is a critically important period or sensitive period for the development of executive functions and therefore self-regulation. So if we can provide experiences which facilitate self-regulation in those years, and again, those are the years that the early childhood care and education people are working with the children, again, we can improve the long-term outcomes of the children. So this is, again, something which the early childhood care and education workers need to realize the importance of that particular kind of skill and need to think about ways they can incorporate experiences which help those skills in their work with their children. So what influences self-regulation? Age, gender, birth weight, poverty, mother's education, father's education, socioeconomic status, all of those standard socioeconomic factors, but also the home learning environment. The type of parenting and learning experiences provided in the home is critically important. Early childhood care and education quality affects self-regulation. Early child care, education and care duration affects self-regulation as well. In the effective preschool, primary and secondary education study in the UK, we looked at over 3,000 children from 1997 to 2015, from birth to age 18. What we found, to summarize over 100 papers, early childhood care and education and the home learning environment in the early years affected educational and social development throughout school and into adulthood. These long-term effects were preceded by improvements at the start of school in language development and self-regulation. Here's an example of the effects on, in this case, maths. I could have chosen almost any educational outcome. I'm showing maths here. We see birth weight, gender, socioeconomic status, mother's education, the biggest effect of all. Then we have father's education, about half that is mother's education. So now we know mothers are twice as important as fathers, okay? Or we should tell those fathers to get off their backside and do a bit more with the children. Okay? Then we have, allowing for all those other factors, the effect of family income. Then we have the effect of the home learning environment, the next most important factor after mother's education. And this is measured at age 3. It was a measure of learning experience provided by the parents in the home for children. I can explain it in more detail later. Then we have the effect of having good quality early childhood education and care after that. And then finally, the effect of the primary school that the children is going to. Okay? Now we see that 2 factors which are only apparent in the preschool years, namely the home learning environment, measured at age 3, and the preschool quality experiences that the children had are having long-term effects at age 10, age 11, age 14, age 18, and so on. And we're right through to adulthood. And it's not just educational outcomes, it's social outcomes. Here we look at self-regulation and pro-social behavior at age 11 and 14 in relation to early childhood care and education quality, having allowed for every other factor in the study. And we see the yellow is the poor quality, the red is the average quality, and the blue is the high quality. And we see that self-regulation is clearly affected by the quality of early childhood care and education, as is pro-social behavior, and other aspects of social development as well. I also did an analysis of how likely it is that your child would develop special needs in the course of the years 5, which is the start of school in England, to 16 years, which is where we have the data readily available. And what we see is that on the left are children with no preschool, no early childhood education and care experience. And they form the baseline measure of odds ratio of 1. Providing low quality early childhood care and education decreases the risk of special needs by 40%. And if you go to medium quality early childhood care, it's about 42%. But then go to high quality early childhood education, and it's almost 60% reduction in special educational needs. So now think of the cost of special educational needs for the educational system. It's a tremendously big saving there. Okay, so interactions drive development. Interactions both in the home, like the home learning environment, and in early childhood care and education have effects on developmental outcomes. The effects in the early years for language development and self-regulation seem particularly important for long-term outcomes. This suggests interactions involving language development and self-regulation are particularly important aspects of the quality of early childhood care and education. Okay? The policy implications here. Early childhood care and education can benefit all, but disadvantaged children benefit the most. The quality of early childhood care and education matters, so we should ensure that high-quality early childhood care and education is available for disadvantaged children. We should differentially allocate our resources so our best staff work with our poorest children. Early childhood care and education training should include interaction skills to boost language development and self-regulation. High-quality early childhood care and education can reduce special educational needs, therefore producing big savings in that respect as well. So early childhood care and education is part of the infrastructure for a successful society. But as James Heckman said earlier, parenting, in this case the home learning environment measure, is also extremely important. In our later studies, we find parenting effects, not just the home learning environment, but other aspects of parenting are also extremely important. And training of parents in interaction skills with their children can be very beneficial for the long-term outcomes of the children, because parenting effects are remarkably powerful. I recently published a paper on the economic and non-economic aspects of disadvantage. How could you measure a disadvantage economically? This is measuring disadvantage by non-economic factors like parenting. And we find that you get differential effects on child outcomes of these two different kinds of disadvantage. And the children who are most disadvantaged are the children who suffer both economic and non-economic disadvantage. But you can find non-economic disadvantage independently of economic disadvantage. Okay, I will finish there.
We need to stop there?
Yeah, we'll stop.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much. And now we're gonna turn to Professor Nina Modi, who will basically reflect on what you just heard, and then ask a few questions, maybe two, because we are kind of running out of time.
I will be quick, because that was an excellent and very clear exposition. Thank you very much for that. I mean, you absolutely highlighted the key areas that policymakers should take note of: language, training for executive function, the role of carers, teachers, schools, but also parents. I think that encapsulates a wonderful talk. And because we're running out of time, let me get straight to the point. Where do you think policies that promote what you've described as hugely advantageous, particularly for the most disadvantaged children, where have you seen policies enacted that have been particularly impactful and powerful? And is there anything that you would wish, if we had an audience full of policymakers here, is there anything that you would wish to say to them?
Well, all of those things I've just said at the end, I would say all those things to them. But what we want to do is we want to have those people who work with young children, including parents, to understand some basic principles of what affects children's development. You know, the fundamental principle, interactions drive development. You know, I've had mothers say to me, what's the point of talking to my child? They don't say anything, you know? So, you know, we got to get, and we need to get that across in terms of basics of brain development. Those basic facts I showed on the slide of brain development, and what Charles Nelson was showing, I would like to see incorporated in secondary education for every person in the country. Okay? So that's one thing. And we should train people in interaction skills. We found that certain kinds of interactions are particularly powerful in improving language development and self-regulation. We did randomized controlled trials of a professional development program in Australia. We found improvements in their outcomes for the children. We repeated the experiment, the randomized controlled trial in China. The effects were even stronger, probably because the Chinese educators responded to our training rather better than the Australian educators who were more bolshy. We've just repeated the randomized control trial in England, this time with early primary school teachers, and we find finding positive effects. And what you need to do is to show the kinds of interactions which involve scaffolding and something which we call sustained shared thinking, which involve long interactions where the child and the adult interact in ways where the child controls the situation, but the adult scaffolds the environment around the child to enable the child to solve the problem, okay, or address the issue. And that takes, it's not a 30-second type interaction, it's a more extended 2, 3, 4, 15, 20-minute interaction. And we need to train staff and parents in how to give these kinds of interactions to children.
So, Edward, you got a very well-deserved round of applause for that. We have to train people, caregivers, yes. Do you think that educational services for the under-5s should also be tasked with educating parents? Might that be a way to implement this?
I think some of the things which we've been talking about at this conference should be incorporated in a syllabus on human development, which should be in every secondary school in the country. Every child should have, some basic knowledge about what's going to affect their children. There will be some people who will object to this. The children will say, "Oh, Mum, you didn't do this for me," and things like that. But I think that's a minor disadvantage. But you need everybody to understand the importance of these factors.
Talk to your little children. Absolutely. Final point, if I may, Chair, and that is to come back to the policymakers. What's the key to unlocking this to become a national priority in every country in the world?
A lesson I've learned in changing policy is you have to provide an economic excuse for your argument. I've presented evidence to Treasury where that evidence is impeccable, okay? The strongest it could possibly be. And they say, but what about this? No. When I then tag along with it an economic excuse which goes with the scientific findings, they pay attention. It's one reason why James Heckman's work has been so tremendously powerful. It's because he's a Nobel laureate in economics. He can talk to any treasury in the world, and they'll pay attention, because he's got economic arguments. And you need to give an economic excuse. I've given economic excuses for some of my arguments where the economic excuse has actually been pretty shaky, right? But to tell you the truth, it didn't matter, because the people in the Treasury wanted to do the right thing, but their job demanded of them that they provide an economic excuse for doing the right thing. So you give them the economic excuse, and then they'll do the right thing.
Very, very, very wise words.
Okay, so now we move on to real-life application of the neuroscience of learning. That's your job, Kari, to show us what we can do in real world.
Well, this is a big charge, folks. And first, I want to say how excited I am to be here. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you to the Babalu Foundation. Thank you, UNESCO, for having such a wonderful conference. So I was asked to talk about innovations to promote child development and learning. Now, you've already heard some of them with some of the wonderful programs that you're doing, Gregoire, what we heard from Liz Spelke and what they're doing in nations in Ghana, like Ghana. But what if you can't get more education to women in the society? What if you can't do it and you just need some solutions that are out there? And maybe we should think beyond schools. And maybe we should find ways to involve parents in what I'm going to tell you about now, which is playful learning landscapes. And I think Liz was the one who told you there were some interesting results when you just got parents to play with their kids. So I think you've heard again and again and again this morning a common theme. And I think that common theme has been, do you want to say it, Ted? Interaction drives development. So all of the speakers who have gone before me have told you this fundamental line. If we don't get more parent-to-child, caregiver-to-child interaction, we probably aren't going to build the kind of brains that we're hoping to build. So the crazy idea that I started with is, what would happen in the world if we taught kids in the way that brains learn? I know it's quite dramatic. So the idea was, what if we used placemaking? And placemaking came in our world into the terms of playful learning landscapes. What do I mean by that? How about transforming cities into family-friendly, inclusive spaces that would also support learning? Well, what in the world could that look like? My journey actually began when I asked a simple question. When is a bench not a bench? Now, benches are really kind of boring. They're pretty functional. They're all over the place. But what could you do with a bench that maybe would have games around it, or ways to help parents and kids have a conversation about something other than the bench? Now, when there's just a bench, do we all know what parents do? And kids sitting right beside them? Okay, you can show me. It's this. The phones come out, they're sitting right next to their child, and they're on their phones. Could we come up with any way to get the parents off the phone and have them interacting with the kids? Did you know that at least in the United States, and I think it's close to this number here, children spend only 20% of their waking time in school? Now think about that. The question I asked is, what are we doing with the other 80%? There's a lot of community out there. There's a lot of experiences out there. There's a lot of places where parents and children go and where they wait for very long times. So our mission was to transform the everyday places where people wait into learning opportunities that maximize the other 80%, and to increase child outcomes in STEAM, literacy, and social development through placemaking. And the idea was that if we could do this in the everyday environment and increase those interactions, what could we get on the other end? So, our projects thus far have been found around the globe. We are in 22 cities and in 13 countries. And we're using an equation that you could probably have come up with yourself after listening to these magnificent talks today. We call it our three-part equation. Part one of the equation, you've heard time and time again. It's got to be community values. It's got to be parent interaction. People have to share what they think is meaningful. And if they don't, it's just not going to sit. It's not going to help the kids. Two, kids learn in a certain way. We all talked about brain learning thus far, and if you read hundreds and hundreds of papers out there, you'd find that there are certain themes that you've heard, and I'll just articulate now. Kids learn best when they have agency. when they're active, not passive. They learn best when they're engaged, not distracted. You heard about EF, executive function skills. They're really critical, and they're part of really being engaged in something and attending. Kids learn best when it's meaningful, not when it's disjointed. Brains learn best when you're in social interaction. You got that same theme again, I know. Interaction drives development. See, we have it as a theme for the whole day. They learn best when they see things presented in multiply different ways, but you're going toward the same goal. I call that iterative. And believe it or not, they learn best when things are interesting and joyful, not when they're boring. And if you do a survey of kids around the world and ask them the first thing they want to tell you about school, the answer is boring. All right, so we take active, engaged, meaningful, socially interactive, iterative, and joyful. Add a learning goal, and we call it playful learning, because those same characteristics of how you learn and how the brain learns, you do in play. It's amazing. And what are the outcomes? Well, Jim Heckman already told you we need to broaden our way of thinking about those outcomes, and we have in what we call the 6 C's. I apologize because I used English here for all these C's, but bear with me for just a moment. You know what's at the base? Collaboration. It's got to be through relationships. Built on relationships, you just heard from Ted, it's language and emotion regulation, because we call that communication. Third is content. You won't learn content if you don't have the communication skills that are built on the collaboration skills. Next is critical thinking built on content, creative innovation that is built on the critical thinking and the content. And finally, I shoehorned this one, confidence. But I think it's important, and it's been mentioned before, that we learn from failure. It's really important to have the grit to get up, dust off your shoes, and try again. So we put in confidence, learning from failure, and grit, and we also put in growth mindset. And I'm happy to tell you Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth have both endorsed it, so I'm feeling good about it. So they're the 6 C's. All right, so you might ask, how do we apply that 3-part equation? We're doing it in Playful Learning Landscapes, which is our community-based interventions. We're doing it in schools, and Making Schools Work was our last book on showing how to apply this in the school environment. And we're doing a very large study that I wish I could tell you about today, but I can't in 12 minutes, about applying that equation to schools. And we're also doing it in the digital world. How can we live in a world of AI, ChatGPT? What's it going to take, and what's really going to be educational digital media? All right. All of the stuff I'm going to tell you about is backed by a strong research base. We've published and published. I think we have 25 papers now on Playful Learning Landscapes alone. And now I'm going to run through some examples just to show you what this could look like. We met with the community. It's an under-resourced area in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Happened to be a square there. And in that little plot of land, that was the plot of land where Martin Luther King gave a Freedom March speech. So the community really cared about it. And they asked, couldn't we do something there to represent what Martin Luther King did? Now we've got the community values part 1 of the equation. Part 2, can we do something that's active and engaging, meaningful, socially interactive? Yes, we can overlay those on the community desires. And what do we get? A puzzle of Martin Luther King. In fact, we did 3 puzzles at that location, and they were iterative because we changed the puzzle on each side of the circles that you see. We had 4 different installations, and you can see Itai Palti, who is our architect, and Brenna Hossinger-Das, a postdoc at the time, who has led our mission there. We had over 100 community participants design the installations. What did we find? When we compared it to an active control of a playground, we found before and after effects, parents started talking with their kids. Moreover, they started talking about the stuff that was relevant to the installations. Can you align the pictures here? Can you make this match? What can you do on the bottom versus top? I'm hearing spatial language, and spatial language predicts later mathematical ability. Boom. But the bus stop in Santa Ana, California, where it's an 80% Latina population, wasn't going to be the same as the one in Philly. Community involvement, part one of the equation. What was it going to look like? They asked, could we put a game, Loteria, which they played in Mexico, at the bus stop? And so with the community, we designed the cards, and now that bus stop is going up in a couple weeks in Santa Ana, California. Yes, everything is in Spanish, and they're going to be able to play games like memory games and attention games while they're waiting for the bus in this under-resourced environment. Well, that is not where we stopped. Somebody asked, could you transform libraries? So we went into the local libraries in our under-resourced, disadvantaged communities. We said, let's build a new kind of library. What if we had a letter wall that's a climbing wall in the library? All of a sudden, the kids tried to make words. They tried to spell things. And you can see in the middle here, we cut out a space in the books, in the stacks, and we put a tangram puzzle in it. And the kids could solve the tangram puzzle. Are you hearing math? You should be. And they could take out the puzzle pieces, and that became the seating at the library. That was Playberry. By the way, I should tell you, that community got more library cards after we'd put in this installations. Everybody was going to the library. And the parents who used to sit there with their cell phones put the cell phones down. We study it through observational data. I want to take you to, you may be thinking, oh my gosh, these things cost so much. So the next one is something called fraction ball. It was done by a postdoc in my lab, Andy Bustamante, who's now at the University of California, Irvine. It cost us 65 euros. Okay? What did we do? We went out, I'm serious, and we repainted a basketball court. We all went out with paint, and where you would throw the three-point line, we made it the 4-4 line, or the 1, or the three-quarter line, or the half line of 0.5. And we just had the kids play. 4th to 6th graders, so a little older than our group, but I want to show you that this can go all the way up with placemaking. What did we find? They played it 4 times at gym, 15 minutes each time, okay? Total. Went back in their class, and all of a sudden, they were passing standard fraction to decimal conversion tasks. Amazing. Supermarkets. Here's what we did in supermarkets. We put up signs. The signs are not so sophisticated. They're things like, how much does the tomato weigh? Or just having conversations about different milk products. When the signs were up, we got 33% increases in parent-child interaction compared to when the signs were down. We've also done this in laundromats and in corner stores in Chicago. Next, murals. Murals, you can find a local artist who can come up with the flavor of the mural, but we build the science right in, active, engaged, meaningful. Look, here's a mural from Santa Ana, and you can see that we made it into an I Spy game. Again, parents and children are so much more interactive when they're looking at these murals that are now on the side of buildings that were actually quite ugly before. And we're also doing a project of murals in hospital waiting rooms. People spend a lot of time waiting in hospital waiting rooms. Once we added these murals, all of a sudden, people started talking with one another. Now, I should tell you that we have a whole lot more that I can't even show you today because 12 minutes just isn't enough time. But we can even adapt the architectural style to wherever we're going in the world. We were asked to do a project in Venice, Italy, and so we adapted, you see here a kind of hopscotch on the bottom. That's adapted from the happy sad task, which is used to study executive function. And we have a little sign that says, can you jump once where you see 2 feet and 2 feet where you see 1? Mix it up a little. People are having fun, and they're interacting all the way. So the key. Our 3-part equation takes culture and community values very seriously. It takes parent involvement very seriously. We can add to any of that what the characteristics of play, or how the human brain learns, are for the how of learning. And then in the what of learning, I want to take what Jim Heckman told us earlier so seriously. Folks, we haven't been measuring the right stuff. And even when we try to measure the right stuff, we do it with tests that are so narrow and assessments that are often so meaningless. We're working on it, guys. We're working on it. I promise you that sometime in the next decade, even before that, we will have a creativity measure. It's happening. People are working on it. Critical thinking, there are measures already. So bear with us and recognize that we need a fuller palette, or what we call at Brookings, a breadth of skills approach, as we prepare for a world that is infused with AI, because otherwise we're not going to outsmart the robots. We're going to be their servants instead of the robots being our servants. We've developed playbooks in multiple languages to get the communities involved: Spanish, Portuguese, English, and Chinese. We have measurements that we put out a whole piece at Brookings about how you can measure playful learning landscapes in our metrics format. And our work, I think, demonstrates that if we just change the lens on how we see the world around us, we can change child-caregiver interactions, because we know they matter. Interactions drive development through placemaking and create a more inclusive, child-friendly city that sparks learning. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. And now we're going to have Angela basically reflect on what we just heard and ask a couple of questions and engage the conversation with Katie.
Can you hear me? Hi. Well, thank you, Kathy. That was so inspiring, and I'm just going to take a big breath and soak it all in. I would like to, spotlight a couple of key ideas there that I think are so relevant and so operational, and then I have a couple of questions. Just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, my work focuses on parents and caregivers, and I work with government agencies and community organizations to bring parents into their work, to make sure that we're creating programs that are responsive culturally and safe, and also responsive to needs today. So that's the work that I'm bringing to this. So what I love this key principle of meeting parents where they're at. I think it's fantastic that you are asking, where do parents go? What do they already do? And then you're building a community of partners to go in and, I think, create solutions and environments that make it so easy to engage in those behaviors that promote development. And that's fabulous. That's such an elegant way to mobilize the research. I'm so inspired. And I think that that's exactly the kind of solutions that we need today, because parents are struggling. So I don't know if it's the same here, but I know that there's lots of data in Canada and in the US showing that parents are just really struggling today. There's the challenges of bringing up the kids in increasingly complex and unstable world, and then you add a layer onto that with parents who are experiencing poverty, discrimination, trauma, and then you add a whole other layer of parenting today where we're parenting in a world that's so different from the one that we grew up in, where there is parenting or any kind of information, sometimes conflicting information, available online 24/7, and then there's social media with the culture of comparison. It's a lot of pressure that parents are facing today, and I think that comes with stress, overwhelm, and also shame, which is something I study. I just want to mention this stat that I saw last week, that the US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, said that 41% of parents in America are reporting feeling stress that impact their daily functioning. So that's 1 out of 2 or 3 parents. That's huge, which is why I think solutions like what you just presented are so valuable, because you are taking away the barriers. You're not giving parents one more thing to do, but you are meeting them where they're at and not just telling them, but showing them. Because what we found is that parents, most often, they know what they need to do, but there are some legitimate barriers in the way that is blocking their access to get there. So I love that. I think it's a very compassionate solution. And I also want to say that we heard a few of these solutions today of meeting parents where they're at. I think the home visits that Professor Heckman spoke to, Dr. Marcella Pina, even with the using of digital solutions. And maybe I'll spotlight a couple in Canada. We have a text messaging message for early parents, so parents in the prenatal and postnatal period, where we text them information that is related to where they're at, the baby's at developmentally, but also how to look after themselves. And then there's also some public health campaigns that are conducted entirely on social media and by podcasts. And I think these are different examples of how we can meet parents where they're at. Also highlight too, there's an example that I heard from Babilu family here, where parents are given a traveling suitcase of activities. So parents are not sent away with more reading material, but rather given a suitcase of activities that they can play after care with their kids. So different examples like that. And I just wanted to bring attention to that, so thank you. The question comes from this. The second one I want to spotlight is that this brilliant idea of looking at ordinary spaces and then going, how can we unlock the potential here for play and connection? And yeah, that's fantastic, right? There's so much potential. And I've definitely met parents and teachers who are good at doing that, like who are good at looking at a hallway and transforming it to an obstacle course or breaking up a long car ride with interesting games. But I almost think that you need a sensibility of playfulness to find those opportunities. And so here's my question. I wonder about the parents who maybe haven't had a chance playing or haven't been able to engage and play very much. And especially, I work with many immigrant families in Vancouver, and I think that if you've had to work really hard and endure a lot of sacrifices, that there isn't really a lot of time for play and even connection. So I wonder if there's anything you've come across in your work where where it's helpful to get adults to play who might not have had a lot of experience, or maybe even to shift that paradigm of play is a waste of time or play is not learning, you know, that false dichotomy that's out there. Yeah, like that's something I'm really curious about.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for raising it. And yeah, there's a lot of parents who are fearful of the word play. There's a lot of us who are, are fearful of the word play. Like, when's the last time you were skipping? We could ask everybody, when's the last time you skipped?
It'll be today when everybody skips.
We tend not to do it. But the point about this is, in Playful Learning Landscapes, we've created a new intergenerational piazza. And I will tell you what the parents said when we had our first meeting with the community, because it was so powerful. We asked, what would you like to do? We're here to be part of and to help whatever your dream is come true. And they said, what we really want, for years our kids have been leaving the areas that we live in. They don't want to come back. It's not beautiful. It's not a place that they feel safe in. It's not a place that they trust. So what we really want is for you to help us create more beauty in our community so that our kids can learn in a safe place. And we took that very, very seriously. And we worked with them so that we would create opportunities for them to play in the environment with their kids. We didn't tell them they had to. We just watched to see what happens. And it's fascinating. When you put adults in these particular situations, they start playing. Example. One of the things we know in early math is that the number line is really important. Now, one way you can teach the number line is to stand up at a chalkboard, and teach the number line. But another way you can do it is just put a number line on the ground and see what happens. So, we just put a number line on the floor, and kids start measuring things. And then the adults start measuring things. Then they all measure how far they can jump. So I wondered, is this universal? What would happen? I'm down in Bogota, Colombia, and it was a very, very, very poor school. In fact, they didn't even have paper. So they gave me a piece of chalk, and I took the chalk, and I got down on my knees, and I drew a number line, okay? That's all I did. And I waited to see what was going to happen when we changed the space. What happened? And we had like 5 big boxes, because that's as far as I could get before the kids were on my back. Okay, so they started jumping from space to space. Then the kids decided they would measure themselves. Then the kids decided they would go get objects from the room and outside. And they came in with rocks. And they put 5 rocks in the 5 space. And they put 4 rocks in the 4 space. Those kids are really doing number. And they're doing it through play. One more example is that we created, see, I couldn't tell you all of them, but just one more. There's this thing called Play Wall that we created. And it's just, we just took a piece of plywood and we painted it like a chalkboard, okay? And on the top, we said, when I was little, I played. And then we had, I played blank. I played blank. I figured it would take a while. We put it up in a very, very low-income area in Philadelphia. And we wanted to see if anyone would fill it in if we just left the chalk, okay? And I had some community members who were working with me. And what did we find? In 2 hours, people who you would never have expected to have ever played in their life, you know, came up and went, I remember playing marbles. I remember playing Foursquare. Now you have the stuff that matters to them, then you have something to work with. And because it matters to the community and they had agency in developing it, there's one other really cool outcome. In Philadelphia, in the area that we first started in, this urban thinkscape, you would see graffiti almost everywhere in this part of the city, okay? We're now 8 years from the first urban thinkscape, no graffiti. Why? Because we don't own it. The community does. And remember that cities have budgets. And because cities have budgets for bus stops, and cities have budgets for libraries, what you find is that this doesn't take foundation dollars to sustain. It sustains on its own.
Great, thanks so much. Theater. So we have literally 6 minutes to have a couple of questions from the audience because we want to hear you. So if there is any way that we can have mic on the floor so people can ask questions. Nah? Impossible? Okay. Ah. No, no way. Or they cannot hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all.
Very quick questions. Like, we want to hear the question.
Okay, the questions that we are talking about, the parents' interaction. The problem, first of all, my name is Bushra Kadura. I work for the Sharjah Education Authority in UAE. The question is that what we're facing challenges is not with the parents' interaction with the disadvantaged and poor families. Our biggest problem is with the rich families that are not interacting. And this is really a challenge for us. So they're not going to the places, even if they have it. They're interacting on their phone. How can we solve this problem?
Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in.
But like quick answers too.
Yeah, quick answer. One, we did a lot of, I did some of the first research on what cell phones do to interactions. And you can call it a killer, an interaction killer. Okay, all I'll say is that we've tested out some of the playful learning landscapes in affluent areas as well. And amazingly, the parents buy in and the phones go down.
Okay. Other questions? Or maybe you
I would say, you know, make the parents aware of the importance of interaction and brain development in the early years and how interaction affects brain development. And those rich parents, they'll change because they don't want to be the parents whose kids are dumb. Okay? they are competitive with other rich parents.
I can't see anything from here, so just let me know if there is a question. Just raise your hand.
If you have a question, stand up. No, I think we're good, Grégoire.
Oh, there's someone just over here, but I don't know how is it. Do we have a mic upstairs? Yes, you can.
Wow.
Wow. No, keep going, keep going. We can hear you. But the question, what is the question? Wants to go?
Well, I found that when parents understand that they can have conversations, even with like 10-week-old babies, that's a lot of joy. And it gives them something back that they didn't necessarily have when they were thinking that all they had to do was change diapers and there was nothing here. So, you know, I hear you and you're quite right, the quality matters. But if they build that from an early age, you know, when their baby's early, it's amazing how it blossoms.
Also, you need to think about the sort of hierarchy of emotions, of motivation rather, hierarchy of motivation. If some of the basic biological needs of the parent are not being met, if they're poor, they don't have enough to eat, if they don't have a decent place to live in, and so on, then it's very difficult to think about how to learn new ways to interact with your child. So sometimes you have to think about how you can alleviate some of those basic needs in order to free up the mental space in parents to learn new interaction skills. Because I had this actually going back to the 1980s with actually a childcare setting. The childcare setting was in a dangerous environment. The childcare workers spent so much time protecting the children from hurting themselves in the dangerous environment, they never actually interacted with the children. And that was a center we managed to get closed down. But this applies in parents as well. If some basic biological needs are not met, then it becomes very difficult to actually learn new interaction skills.
And I'll just quickly add to that, sometimes parents may come from childhood where there's not a lot of connection, and it is actually something to unlearn or maybe relearn around connecting with a child and finding joy in it. But I find that modeling really helps. So in Canada, for example, there are these, in the theme of going to where parents already are in vaccination appointments with babies, the nurses will also model how to do those serve and return interactions, and yeah, like and that has been shown to help as well. So modeling and also meeting parents where they're at and understanding that there are other factors that might underlie that they have to, that there's more work to do in that.
Well, like we stopped right on time. Fantastic. Like incredible. We're gonna give a big round of applause for all the speakers, all the experts. And we're going to thank you a lot for your attention and for the great questions.